Somewhere in the infrastructure of every pond and water feature is some sort of pipe, tubing, or plumbing. And yet, it's hardly ever talked about. So before you just go out and buy the first type of plumbing or piping that you see, let's get practical. So there are a lot of different types of tubing on the market, and of course each general type of tubing comes in different brands and so forth. We're not going to get super hyper specific on this episode, but we are going to talk a little about the different types of tubing options that are available to you and the advantages and disadvantages of each type. First of all, particularly in, say for example, your large box stores or other outlet type places of buying water feature products, you're going to find what I call Superflex. Now it has lots of different kind of names, but this tubing is actually a very thin-walled, spiral-bound tubing. It comes in different brands, like I said, and actually it comes in two colors, green and black. And those colors aren't just random, they actually mean something. This tubing comes in standard sizes, the sizes that we're used to here in the United States. 1 inch, 1.25 inches, 1.5 inches, 2 inch, 3/4 inch, and so forth. But this tubing also comes in metric sizes. You can buy this in millimeter sizes. And generally speaking, the black tubing is the standard and the green tubing is the metric. So the advantage of this tubing, first of all, it's going to be the least expensive of the types of tubing that you can buy. And secondly, it's extremely flexible, and that's where the name Superflex tubing comes from. That'd be definitely one of the advantages of this particular type of tubing. However, I would not consider this the type of tubing you would expect to see in a professional water feature. This is the kind of tubing, and again, I don't mean this nasty since I'm here to talk to the do-it-yourselfer, but I would consider this the kind of tubing most often selected by a homeowner. So why do I say that this tubing is generally selected by a homeowner? Well, first of all, it's easier to work with. At least in general, it's easier to work with. This kind of tubing, you can run one solid piece from your pump to your water feature. You can go up and around and through whatever you need to. That's the upside of this tubing. The way this tubing works, you would use what's called a barbed fitting. And those fittings are readily available in a lot of different options, but some of the options that we get into in the more professional pond installations are not going to be found in a barbed fitting. So that's one reason I consider this a little less of a professional solution. The other thing about this tubing that makes it not the choice of most professionals, while it's easy to work with, it isn't extremely durable. Over time, this tubing will get brittle, especially if it's in the sunlight or in the cold weather. This tubing will get stiff. Right now it's Superflex, but it's going to get stiff and brittle. I remember last year I was called out on Christmas Eve to a customer's pond. They had a preformed pond they had put in themselves. They had a a pump sitting down in the pond attached to Superflex tubing. In the very cold weather, they were running this. They didn't have an electric outage, so they weren't having any trouble with their pump. But sure enough, when it got real cold, this piping broke in the winter. And so on Christmas Eve, I was out helping a customer repair a leak in their piping. This type of tubing would be, you might need to heat it up a little bit to push it on here. In this case, you can see it fits fairly well. This would be pushed onto the barb. I'd have to push that a lot harder, but I don't want to have trouble getting it back out. And then you would clamp this with a pipe clamp, with one of those little stainless steel pipe clamps. That's how that particular type of tubing works. A second option for tubing would be what we call flexible PVC. Here's an example of 2-inch flexible PVC, and over here you see some smaller 1-inch flexible PVC. And again, this is still flexible. In the larger sizes, it's not nearly as flexible, but it's still flexible as compared to traditional rigid PVC piping, and we're going to talk about that next. Flexible PVC is not flexible enough to go up over an edge and right down the other side. You're never going to get this to cooperate with you that well, especially not in the larger sizes. A little more flexible in the smaller sizes. You can do a lot more with it, but in the larger sizes, not very flexible. The advantage, however, of flexible PVC, in my opinion, over Superflex tubing for certain applications. Again, Superflex works really well in your simple little ponds where you just want to get the tubing from A to B with the least possible effort. The thing about flexible PVC that I find so much better is that it is gluable to regular PVC plumbing, just like rigid PVC is. So now you have the option of using elbows, T's, ball valves, three-way valves, and all kinds of other options. And so whenever you're using this tubing, you can simply glue it into your PVC fittings. You can also get a lot of specialty fittings that take male pipe thread, threaded tubing, or female pipe thread and adapt it to your slip joints for your glued flexible PVC or standard rigid PVC pipe. Now, if you're using flexible PVC, one of the things that I think is very important is to choose your fittings correctly for flexible PVC. What I'm holding in my hand is just an example. These are both couplers. They're both 2-inch couplers. They're both gluable 2-inch PVC couplers. In one sense, you'd say they're the same thing, but you can plainly see they're not the same thing. This PVC coupler has about a 1/2-inch lip, a little more than a 1/2-inch lip on each side. This is a deep dish PVC slip joint fitting, and it has well over an inch, probably 1.5 inches or so on each side of the fitting. When using flexible PVC pipe, I highly recommend that you do not use the shallow dish fittings. Always use the deep dish fittings. Because this flexes, and because it often has a little bend to it, like you see in my sample piece here, when you first put this together, it's going to really be, fighting against you sometimes. And often it'll try to twist out. That deep dish, gluing into that deep dish, is going to give you a good solid glue, a good solid joint that isn't going to be as likely to fail and leak. And so that's why I would highly recommend the deep dish fittings. Now, another type of PVC that we have is the standard, regular, rigid, white PVC piping. When I call this standard, I am referring to Schedule 40 PVC. There are some very thin-walled PVCs on the market, and that is not at all what I would recommend for your pond plumbing. But with the standard Schedule 40 plumbing, you're going to find this to be much cheaper to buy than the flexible PVC. And usually, specifically because it's not flexing, you're going to have a much lower failure rate on a joint gluing rigid PVC. It's going to generally glue much better. It's a little bit more standardized. It's a little bit more more consistent is the word that I'm looking for. When buying flexible PVC, make sure and buy quality. There is some cheap flexible PVC on the market, and sometimes they lack the consistency. You get spots where it's too thin and slides in and out of the joints too easily. But in most cases, it's fine, and we use this a lot in a lot of applications. We also use the standard rigid PVC. Basically, the advantage to rigid PVC is that it's cheaper and it glues stronger, or at least more reliably. However, the disadvantage to standard rigid PVC is that you can't follow the contours of the pond. You can't bury your pipe in the rock on the outside edge. You're going to need to have perfectly straight ditches to bury your line. Now, whether you're using rigid or flexible PVC, one of the great advantages to either is all of the options that you have on the market for adapters and parts of various kinds. Here I'm giving as an example a street elbow. Again, it's deep dish. See how large this joint is here? And this particular one is female to male, so that you can go right around a corner and have as short of an area as possible and go into the next fitting. Now, one of the real advantages to either standard rigid PVC or flexible PVC is all of the different accessories or adapters and parts and pieces that you can get for it. First of all, I have here an example of two unions. These are both standard PVC unions. This one is slip to slip or gluable joint to gluable joint. And this one over here is a gluable joint to a male pipe thread. That pipe thread will of course fit into a bulkhead fitting or other threaded options that you might have. And so you have two ways to put a union on your PVC, whether it's flexible or standard. Now, what's the value of a union? The value of a union is that this middle collar can be turned off, opening the joint. So even after you glue your joints and you have this solid piece of PVC, you can still take this apart. It's got a O-ring in there so it doesn't leak, but it forms a very good, very solid, very trustworthy seal, but it allows you to remove a pump or anything like that from your system. We also have corners, T's, there are crosses like a double T, all kinds of different ways to get around corners or to split into two pieces, things like that. Another great valuable accessory in the PVC is a ball valve. By turning this handle, not easy to do when it's not on a pipe. There we go. By turning this handle, we can close and open or partly close the valve inside. Another type of valve from the ball valve is the knife valve. The advantage of a knife valve, you've got this handle on the top that can partially close or completely close the channel in the knife valve. And that's a gluable PVC part, even though it's in black. We also have a check valve. A check valve, in this case a swing check valve, if mounted the correct direction, will allow water to go one way, like say from your pump to your waterfall, but won't allow the water to come back from the waterfall to the pump. So your waterfall filter won't drain every time you shut the pump off. Well, as you can probably tell, I prefer flexible or rigid PVC wherever they're most appropriate. But of course, the situation you need to also look at when looking for value in tubing is what's available to you. Now, most of your good pond stores, and certainly available online and even at Practical Garden Ponds, you can get both the Superflex or the flexible PVC tubing. We also sell many of the adapters and parts and pieces for either. But you will find rigid PVC at any local hardware store, and that's really your value for finding that. It's accessible. Whether or not all of these unique pieces are accessible at your local hardware, well, probably not, at least not some of them. They get to be more specialty pieces, and so that's where you'll want to plan ahead, think through your job ahead of time what you're going to need, as you may need to make a special trip or order these online. Well, I hope that has answered some of your simple basic questions on tubing and the advantages and disadvantages of the different kinds of tubing on the market. I'm Nate at Practical Garden Ponds. I hope you'll keep watching.